Let's begin our study of animal plants, thinking about the organization of life. And so if we go back to one of the first topics we covered in Bio 211, you may recall that life can be studied at various levels of hierarchical organization. And so we have lower levels of complexity that begin to build up into higher levels. And as you go to a higher level of organization or hierarchy, you're going to be finding emerging properties, new functions, new abilities that lower levels are not going to be able to perform. And so you may recall that one of the most basic levels at which life can be studied is going to be the level of molecules. Molecules can come together in an organized fashion and form organelles, and there are going to be several organelles inside of one cell, cells of many different, cells of the same kind with the same function are going to be organized into what we call a tissue. And a tissue can do now more things because many cells working together can accomplish a goal. We are going to be studying in this class, for example, tissues like epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscular tissues, nervous tissues. And so what we see there is that many cells working together can contribute to something like movement. Many muscle cells working together can allow an animal to go from one place to another. Many epithelial cells can accomplish the task of providing a covering, a protection for the animal, whereas one cell alone can't do that. And so tissues eventually collaborate with other tissues of different kinds to form structures we call organs, and many organs working towards one common goal, one mission in particular, are going to be forming part of organ systems, and eventually you have organisms. And in the case of animals, this is really nice because you can really see all of these levels of organization at work. And so, needless to say, in animals, you can find cells and tissues and organs, organ systems, making organisms like animals. Remember that the level of tissue is one we don't see with the sponges, but all of the eumetazoans from the cnidarians all the way up that are going to be, there's going to be a tissue level of organization. And in this opening illustration, you can see some of those tissues that I've been making reference to, but we're about to take a closer look at all of these types of cells and tissues in the slides to come. So follow me. Let's take a look at the different kinds of tissues that can help make the architecture of the body of an animal. Let's begin with epithelial tissues. So the word epi means on top, and thelial means like a thin layer, well, like a tissue, right? Sounds redundant. And so epithelial tissues, most people think of the outer covering of an organism. Plants also have epithelial tissues, but we'll be talking about plants in our next class, Bio 213. But in the case of the body of the animal, yes, of course, the outer covering is often going to be a place where you can find epithelial cells assembled into epithelial tissues. But it is not the only place where you can find epithelial tissues. Basically, that epi on top can also be the top of an internal cavity or duct, like a digestive tube of an animal. And so lining that inside of those internal cavities of an animal is a place where you can also find epithelial tissues. Another idea that people often think about when you hear the word epithelial is going to be the function of protection. And you are right, epithelial tissues do provide protection, but it is not the only thing that they can do. So as we begin to look at some of these specific types of epithelial tissues, let's make reference to some of the functions they can also perform. And I'm going to see if I can maybe enlarge this image that I have here. So depending on the shape of epithelial cells, tissues are also going to be getting their name. Cuboidal epithelium is going to be the type of tissue that is going to consist of cells that are shaped like cubes, like little boxes. Imagine like a bunch of dice. There are also going to be cells that take the shape of a column, like a pillar. And that is going to be a columnar cell that gives rise to columnar epithelium. Sometimes epithelial cells can be flat, like scales, like tiles. And that is going to be the case of squamous epithelium. And so, what happens with this squamous epithelium is that sometimes you can find it in the form of a single layer, but sometimes you can also find it in the form of many layers, where new layers are actually emerging from the bottom in these basal cells. And then the older cells are being pushed towards the outside, where they are eventually sloughed off. They are eventually lost. You shed those outermost cells of your squamous epithelium. So when you look at these tissues like stratified squamous epithelium, or even in the case of the simple squamous epithelium, the function of those tissues will be indeed protection. But if you look, for example, at the stomach, the gut of an animal, if you look at the intestines of an animal, as you can see here in this illustration, that is going to be a place where you can find columnar epithelium. And this columnar epithelium has a shape that fits its function. It needs to be a little longer in terms of shape in comparison to something like a squamous epithelium, where the flattened nature helps with protection. But in the case of the columnar epithelium, those cells actually can contribute with the absorption of nutrients. Think about the intestine as a place where nutrients that have been already digested need to be absorbed. And so that's one of the functions of the columnar epithelium. Now take a look at something like the cuboidal epithelium, and that these cells can also help with absorption, but they can also help with secretion. And columnar epithelium can do that as well. And so, for example, in the tubules of your kidneys, you're going to be finding cells that can sometimes secrete calcium ions, or can remove those, or magnesium, potassium, or some of the other ions that are being regulated as the filtrate that is moving through your kidneys tubules is going to be refined and processed. And so those additional functions of absorption and secretion are two of those that sometimes at first people don't think when they look at epithelial tissues. The pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue you see here is not one that is very common, and so we are not going to spend much time looking at that. In addition to epithelial tissues, animals are also going to benefit from having connective tissues. And this is like one of the most diverse kinds of tissues you can find in animals, because the cells can be quite different. The tissues that are formed can also have many different functions. I mean, just take a quick survey of what we have in this illustration. Here we see like some loose connective tissue that is going to be helping attach the outer skin to underlying layers of muscle. You can have some fibrous connective tissue, and this is going to be more like in the form of the tendons, those important ligaments that allow for muscles to attach to bone, and they have an elastic nature as well. But think also, for example, about bone. Bone is a type of connective tissue. And we have cartilage, we have blood. Yes, blood is a form of connective tissue as well. And so is adipose tissue, where fat stores for an animal are going to be located. So one of the questions you may ask, why do we call this connective tissue, and where does the name come from? And obviously, connective will make you think about connections, tying things together. And that is indeed the function of many of these connective tissues, like the loose connective tissue, fibrous connective tissue, cartilage, and even bone is doing that. But in addition to those basic essential functions, connective tissues are also going to be in charge of supporting other tissues and organs inside of the body of an animal. Sometimes the cells in connective tissue, like in cartilage or in bone, they're going to be surrounded by an extracellular matrix. Sometimes that matrix is made of protein, sometimes can be a liquid jelly-like solution, sometimes can be a hardened structure like the mineralized nature of bone. Let's take a closer look at connective tissues. and see what we can learn from these. For example, when you look at the loose connective tissue, there are three types of connective tissue fibers. And for example, there's going to be collagenous fibers. These collagenous fibers are going to be providing strength. So that idea that I told you of providing protection can be seen here. Elastic fibers can stretch away and then they can return back to their original length. When you think about uh, objects like your nose, and you can push your nose to one side. I'm sorry for making funny faces for you, but as I release that pressure, the nose returns back to the original position. I can do the same thing with my ear. I can move it forward, but the moment I release it, it goes back, snaps back to its original position. And that is going to be because there are a lot of elastic fibers in those types of cartilage in your nose, in your ears. Reticular fibers are going to be helping connecting. And like I told you, for example, underneath your skin, there's going to be connective tissue that is going to be helping attach to the underlying layers of muscle and bones you're going to have there. And so these are the kinds of fibers you can find in the various kinds of connective tissues. Loose connective tissue is going to have in abundance these collagenous fibers and some of these reticular fibers as well. Let's take a look at muscle tissue. And muscle tissue, by the way, is going to be one of the types of tissues that are unique to animals. And when you look at any other kind of an organism, if it can move, it's actually just one cell. So for example, amoeba, they can move because they have internally proteins that can contract and stretch in the way a muscle cell would do, but it's proteins. It's not a cell. But what we have with animals is actually many cells with an elastic, contractile nature that are going to be working together, contributing to the locomotion of animals. There are three kinds of muscle tissues we can see. One is going to be skeletal muscle. This skeletal muscle is going to be characterized by the striations that look like bands, look like lines, and the darker portions are usually going to be where actin and myosin are overlapping together. The lighter bands is going to be where the Z lines are going to be, where one myomere, a contraction unit within a muscle cell, is going to end, and the next one is going to begin. So that striated nature of skeletal muscle is one of the ways students can easily distinguish this type of muscle tissue and muscle cells. Another characteristic of skeletal muscle that I want you to pay attention, especially in lab, when you're identifying different kinds of cells and tissues, is that skeletal muscle cells are going to be multinucleated. Like a single cell can have many nuclei. And the reason is that during development, there used to be individual cells, but those cells merged together. And then that's why you ended up with longer cells with many nuclei in one cell alone. It's one of those exceptions to the rule that cells have only one nucleus. In the case of skeletal muscle, there will be many. And that is going to be different when you look at something like smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is going to have only one nucleus. And when you look at the cells, you will not see the striations we mentioned before. Well, what about cardiac muscle? Cardiac muscle is going to also be striated. I'm trying to go back to my enlarged view. And I'm hoping that you can see the little lines, the little striations you see over here. But in addition to those striations, you're going to notice something we didn't see in skeletal muscle, and that is going to be these intercalated discs. Those intercalated discs play an important role at coordinating the contractions of muscle cells in your heart so that they can contract in a rhythmical fashion at the same time, leading to the contractions of ventricles so that blood can be pumped out, or the contraction of atria to move blood into the ventricles. And so that coordination is going to be one of the functions that is going to be the missions of these intercalated discs. So pay attention to those also when you're looking at lab. But in addition to that difference, Something that is different in cardiac muscle is that there's going to be only one nucleus per cell. So cardiac muscle may look like skeletal muscle, but there are two key differences I want you to remember. Cardiac muscle cells only have one nucleus, and they have those intercalated discs. All right. So I mentioned that muscle tissue is going to be one of those unique tissues you find in animals. If you're looking at some mysterious tissue somebody brought to you in the lab, and you have to identify where this came from, and you identify one of these kinds of cells, you will know right away that this is a tissue that came from an animal kind of an organism. And the second type of tissue that is unique to animals, there's no other organism on earth that is going to have these kinds of cells and tissues, is going to be nervous tissue. And this is going to be important for sensing what is happening in the surrounding environment. That's what we call stimuli. A stimulus is something that can be detected by an animal and is going to lead to a response. So the signal detected by a sensory organ like eyes or ears or skin or hair, those are examples of sensory structures, will be relayed by neurons to a central structure like the central nervous system of vertebrates. The stimulus, then, that information is going to be processed, is going to be interpreted, and by means of neurons, the central nervous system is going to be sending a message to effector organs. An effector organ, it can be something like wings, your hands, your legs, something that will produce a response appropriate to the events that are taking place in the surrounding environment. If it's danger, well, that means fly away, run away, swim away. If it's something desirable, well, then move in the proximity to maybe getting something to eat, or when an animal finds a mate and the opportunity for mating presents itself. So there are different types of cells you can find in nervous tissue. The most common is going to be neurons. That's the foundation of nerves. When you're looking at a nerve, you're looking at a bundle of nerve cells working together. There's also going to be glial cells, which are going to be providing maintenance. Some of these glial cells are going to be providing nourishment to neurons. Others are going to be separating nerves from other structures in the body. Some of them are going to be helping remove debris, clear away metabolic wastes from neurons. And so those glial cells, or glia, as sometimes scientists describe them, there's many different kinds. There's astrocytes, for example. There's a number of these that can be present in the nervous tissues of animals. And remember, the main function here is going to be that one of sensing the environment, interpreting that information, and then producing the best response. So these are the kinds of tissues that can be found in animals that are going to be making the anatomy of an animal. And in lab, you're going to be exploring more details about these kinds of tissues. And in the topics to come, you will be seeing also more about how these kinds of tissues contribute to not only the functioning of an animal, but also processes like reproduction and survival.